Love them.
Yay! And we are live. Hello, everyone. I shall give people a moment to come over into the chat, into the comments, while we do a quick introductions of ourselves. I am Angeli, Marketing and Publicity Manager for Aconyte Books, and I am here today with the lovely Rosemary Jones. Rosemary, tell us some bits about yourself.
I'm Rosemary Jones, and I am the author of Mask of Silver. Angela asked me to do a product thing because she didn't have it. I'm in the States, so I'm in Seattle, so this is morning for me. And the book is out in print in the States and also an ebook. And in the UK, it's in ebook only, and the print comes out in March.
Yay!
We think, we hope, unless there's another kaiju attack or something like that.
Hopefully, 18th of March here in the UK for anyone waiting for it. But if you are desperate to read it and you're in the UK, EU, you can get the ebook. It's available globally. So grab that from your favorite ebook provider, and you can read it straight away, and then you can buy the physical copy afterwards. Yay!
Yes.
But yes, so we are here today to talk about Mask of Silver and also silent movies and occult horror and mystery.
Arkham Horror.
Thank you very much for coming along and joining. I know it's very early for you.
It is. I apologize for people. I'm going to be clutching my coffee because it's just, like most authors. I'm not a morning person, and this thing is like still. I'm like, oh yeah, Angela's having tea. I'm like clutching coffee and going.
Well, I'm planning my dinner. Nearly the end of the day for me. Oh, so close. A weekend. Yay! Yes. So the book is based in Arkham Horror, which is it's a live card game. It's a board game by FFG, where you run around Arkham, Massachusetts, in the 1920s as an investigator trying to solve occult goings on. So, with that in mind, can you tell us a little bit about Mask of Silver?
So Mask of Silver was set in the 1920s, and it's actually set in 1923, which is slightly before the game. So when you show up in Arkham in 1926, you may run into some of the people who are mentioned in Mask of Silver. And I do remind people that this is kind of before they're investigators, or they're just starting to be investigators. So maybe I'll give you a little bit of background on a couple of the canon characters who do pop up. But the majority of the book, it follows a film crew and their director who has a great idea. He's going to film a horror movie in his hometown. So he packs them all up from Hollywood, takes them to Arkham, puts them up in his house because he's kind of cheap, but he doesn't want to pay for a hotel. And turns out that was all a very, very bad idea. As our heroine, Jeannie Lin, who is a costume designer and prop maker for this silent movie, kind of quickly clues into, and then basically has to persuade everybody else to get out before it all goes south in a really major way. So that's the short brief. But it was a lot of fun because I'm quite obsessed with the silent movies of that era. And when Aconyte asked me about writing a media tie-in novel, I mean, it was either going to be it was either going to be that or possibly Five Rings, because I also love that game in the FFG universe. But I was really happy when they picked Arkham Horror because I really wanted to do it. I've long wanted to mix magic and fantasy and the silent movies. So this was an opportunity to do all those things.
So you play the Arkham games then?
Yeah. I'm a gamer from long way back. Really been playing since college and all sorts of different platforms. I'm still playing today, except it's all online because we can't meet up with my friends. But it's been kind of fun to get into that now because we play on a couple of different platforms, so we do a couple of different things. I'm on Board Game Arena like every other Sunday night with a group who keeps challenging me with, "Hey, we've never played this game before. Let's try that." Yeah, that's been kind of fun.
Excellent. Yeah, I've not played the LCG. I played Mansions of Madness, so I played the sort of the more board game app version. which I like. I die more often than I survive the occult horror.
Yeah, I think that's for those who like are into role playing. Way back in the day, there was Call of Cthulhu, and FFG actually had a Call of Cthulhu property as well. You know, and the joke about it was that was the RPG where, you know, your best case scenario was you got out completely insane.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario was you died in the first 20 minutes, so always have a backup character rolled.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I played a couple of one-shots, and one of them we were playing in the 1960s, and we were on a plane going from LA back to London, and my character and my friend who played the twin, we were so high on whatever drugs we smuggled onto the plane that we couldn't go insane. So we're the only ones that survived.
There you go, psychedelic. Yeah, there's a lot of people who say, yeah, it's really interesting because it's like a lot of games are pretty much geared for you to quote win, and the interesting thing has always been about Arkham has been winning is very, very strangely defined in Arkham. So you survive. I try to keep a little bit of that spirit in the book, and no spoilers, but it's homage to Mary Roberts Reinhardt, which was a very popular author in the 1920s, who perfected a style of mystery novel called the Had I But Known. And her books always open with usually her female narrator going, had I but known, I wouldn't have gone to that spooky old house in New England. And so that seemed like a terrific way to have Jeannie introduce you into Arkham, is had she but known, she wouldn't have taken this job in Arkham, but she did. So this is kind of how she survives it.
And we have our first question already. So, how did you decide which of the Arkham Games investigators to include in the book?
It kind of fell into who was it logical for them to meet, and then with the help of FFG, a couple of people, because as I said, it's 1923 and it's not 1926. I had a couple of people I wanted to have in the book, and I got told, no, they're not there yet, so you can't use them. So hopefully we can come back and use them again in a different book, in a different time period. But the two that pop up, it made sense for them to interact with the crew. And so and I hope that it seems very organic when you meet them. And there's maybe a couple of foreshadowings too. There's a couple of, one reviewer spotted and said, wait a minute, is this person going to become an investigator? I was like, maybe.
Can you tell us anything about the investigators without spoiling the book, or is it best to read it?
Well, it's always best to read it. It's always best to buy the book. So I have to. Pete and his loyal dog Duke show up because I love Pete, and I have always, every time Pete comes up when I'm playing, I always want, there's something about Pete and his faithful canine companion that I always enjoy. So I really wanted Pete to show up, and Pete and Duke are instrumental in a couple of scenes.
And Jason's a follow-up question as well. Is the maid in the prologue?
I think so. I think there's a suggestion that the Baker women are a line of slightly magical investigators, and so presumably there's a fair number of Bakers around. And I was hoping to have Agnes show up, but as I said, the timing didn't quite work out for her. But we still get to go to Velma's Diner. Velma's Diner was very important to me, and we have a lot of scenes in Velma's. And we meet some of the other people who kind of precede Agnes into the.
So you're a big silent movies fan, and obviously that has played a big part in the writing of this. Can you talk a little bit about your influence for the writing, some of the films and some of the styles that helped you to write this?
Well, the interesting thing about the silent movies is I think what a lot of people don't realize is, first of all, 90% of everything that was made is gone. This is an entire art that just literally vanished because it was made on a very unstable medium, nitrate film. And it either burned or it was destroyed because of the hazard. And it wasn't valued after sound came in, and people didn't think, they didn't think people would want to see these again. So you have a lot of art, especially those before 1920, and the film industry didn't start in 1920. It really started probably in the aughts, in the start of the 20th century, but by the mid-teens, 1915, 1916, it's really started to boom, not only in the States, but around the world, other than the interruption of World War I, which kind of messed up the European market. But in the United States, we go from an art, live art, theater, et cetera, is available in big cities. Maybe there's some amateur theatricals in small towns. We go from that to, by 1920, there's a movie theater everywhere. And they maybe are not what you think of as a movie theater. They're not these huge, magnificent Grauman's Chinese palace, which was actually built kind of at the end of the silent movie era when everything's gotten really huge. But a lot of them are just spare rooms or empty storefronts. And somebody could rent an empty storefront, throw up a screen, put in a projector, put in some chairs, and you paid 5 cents, you paid a nickel, which is why they were called Nickelodeons. Watched a film. And you watched a film that you could understand no matter what your level of education was or what language you spoke. And then, and for a country that's full of immigrants, not all of them was speaking English or speaking English well. This is a very, really important concept to be thinking about, and something that my characters are going to be talking about a lot. All of a sudden, you have a universal language. Everybody who sees a Charlie Chaplin film understands it because it's there. He's essentially he's miming. You get all the emotions. And you make this connection. And the early movie theaters, when they talk about them, like especially the 19-teens, are not silent places. People go. They shout at the screen. They hiss the villain. They cheer the heroine. They read the cards out loud to each other because maybe not everybody, again, speaks the language or can read. So if there's a little, dialogue card that comes up, everybody's probably shouting that out so everybody else can understand it. Eventually, they'll move in and start doing live music to accompany it. In the bigger theaters, that becomes more formal. You might even have a whole orchestra. And in the very large theaters, you have what the mighty Wurlitzers, which are these organs that can do all kinds of sound effects. And we still have one of the last operating silent movie theaters in the country here in Seattle, the Paramount, where they restored the Wurlitzer, and they will do silent movie Mondays.
Oh,
Go in, and you can have really that late 1920s experience, that 1926 experience, where the film is playing, and the pipes are just literally, it just sort of reverbs through this whole theater. And if you get a really good accompanist, and there's guys who really specialize in this, they can do the doorbell ring, they can do the knock, 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 they can do all sorts of sound effects as well as play the music. And they got to the point where they were composing very complicated scores, the same way we think of film scores today, that were then sent around with the movies toward the end. So that, so all of that kind of, it was an incredible art form that basically got lost. And then people who sort of remembered it started looking for it and finding it and restoring it. Now there's a whole movement around the world to kind of bring this art form back. And it's amazing how much they found that we thought was lost permanently and it's being restored. There's just, and I've gone to several lectures on this. And we have an incredible film festival every year in Seattle, and the International Film Festival, and they've always had kind of a track on silent movies and restoration and bringing stuff back. And not just showing like the 2 or 3, like I said, Charlie Chaplin, really well known, Cecil B. DeMille, some of these other ones, but really showing the diversity of people who are making films. So it wasn't just a big studio production. There were a lot of smaller groups and people who were doing really guerrilla filmmaking. A lot of the tips I give in the book about how they're going to be making the film come from an actual manual about, so you want to make a silent movie. It was written in the 1920s by Anita Loos, who nowadays we kind of know more for writing the book Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, but she was a screenwriter in Hollywood. She, does carefully lays out like how you should do the makeup and how you should do the film, and how much film costs, and so how you should be kind of careful about how much you use up. So, so it was fun to bring those details into the book and kind of weave them through.
Yeah. I bet that's like the things that people like that makes it more real, like when you're reading the book as well, like just these little like tidbits that makes you feel like
I adore historical fantasy. I read a lot of historical fantasy, so I did a lot of different periods. And yeah, I always like it's always fun when you've got a book where it's history and there's stuff, that's real. And then something slides in from the side and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Remember that? And, so that's, so somebody else said, like, you start looking at the mirrors a little sideways after you read the book. So, and there's good reason for it.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Jeannie Lin?
Jeannie Lin is a Chinese-American costume designer who's working in Hollywood. And she's based on a number of Asian Americans who worked in Hollywood in the 1920s. A lot of everybody on the film crew, it really does have historical ancestors, I like to say. While it's not their lives, and I'm not trying to take any real person and just translate them into the fiction, I really wanted to confirm that this would be possible, that this person was where they were doing what they did. And so Jeannie is working essentially behind the camera, which is a little easier if you're Asian American, because you're not subject to quite all the prejudices and restrictions. And that's also very much based on the life of James Wong Howe, who was a cameraman who started in the silent period and continued to work in Hollywood through, really almost till his retirement. He was nominated for an Academy Award for The Bridge Over River Kwai. He, made that transmission into sound. Perfected a lot of camera techniques. He was very influential. And it's very interesting. He goes back and forth at his credits. Sometimes he's listed as James Howe. Sometimes he's listed as James Wong Howe. There's certainly some intimation that he was somewhat concealing his identity of who he was. Although, of course, by the time he's nominated for an Academy Award, everybody, and certainly everybody on the set and everybody, the crews he worked with, knew he was. I mean, he knew he was Chinese American. It wasn't anything. It was quite obvious. But on the other hand, he did hide his marriage to a white woman until that was legal in California. So they lived in the same apartment building, but they didn't live in the same apartment.
Oh.
So, she lived on a different floor. And again, it seems to be that their friends knew they were married because they had been married in Paris where it was legal, but they kind of kept it quiet in California where it was not legal. So, again, there's just these very interesting dynamics going on in that period where it's a very liberal town. It's very open to people of different races working in the movies. And then on the other hand, there are issues. And, so we talk about that a little bit in the book.
Yeah, how do you go about addressing that type of thing for the audience without trying to sound preachy or trying to how do you get that across in the right way?
I think you do it by just saying what the facts were. I mean, this is like, I liked, what reviewers said, it isn't obvious. It's just like these people are there and they mentioned this is an issue, but it isn't, they're not out marching. They're not out protesting, which is they are just living their lives in and around this, which is probably true 99% of the time for most people. They deal with it. They don't, and then they try to correct it where they can. And their friends support and welcome them. So that's, I think, important to show that these things were going on, that this diversity existed. And another couple that is in the book are a pair of women who have had to sort of leave New York theater because they've been outed as a couple due to divorce proceedings and have come to work on the movie as an actor and a screenwriter. And that's actually based on a true divorce case in New York, and a pair of women who did leave New York for a while and pursued a career teaching in Seattle. And I worked for the art college that they taught at in the 1920s. And a friend of mine had found their history and was showing me these articles in a newspaper. And I said, well, this is fascinating, because it wasn't a big deal in Seattle. Again, people didn't really probably follow the New York newspapers. They had the woman who ran the art college obviously just said, hey, you want to come teach? Come, so it's very interesting to see how what we think might have been a huge issue, it was an issue, but at the same time, people just sort of dealt with it by saying, let me be welcoming, let me be inclusive, let me include you over here. So I try to kind of stay true to the period.
Yeah, and I think that's been reflected in a few reviews that I've read as well, that people have picked up that this thing is happening, but it, like, say that it's dealt with in a very sensitive sort of manner that doesn't have you raging against something that has happened and now doesn't, at least in that particular part of.
Well, I think the important thing is, like, all these people went on and had very creative careers, and they had good lives. I mean, I'm sure James Wagahawa wanted to throw things at the wall sometimes, but he had an incredibly successful career in Hollywood. And another actress who is not related to him, Anna May Wong, had an incredibly successful career in the silent movies, but really got tired of being typecast as the Chinese villainess or the Chinese victim. She basically played one or the other, and she was always being either she's invariably named Lotus Flower or Lotus Blossom in all of her silent movies. And, and she was born in California, a California girl, had absolutely no accent, apparently, to anybody who heard her speaking English. And she was constantly being typecast into these parts, to the point where she actually left Hollywood at the end of the silence and went to Europe to act because she could get a broader range of roles there. And so I think Jeannie does talk about encountering her and, how she's trying to help her do a flapper role, which is what apparently Anna May Wong really did want. So, but she's another fabulous actress. You can find parts of her, her performances. They're really incredible. And, and there was a lot of women. I think that's the other thing I really wanted to bring forward. What an exciting time this actually was for women. Remember, the 19th Amendment has passed. Women can now vote in federal elections. They have won a 90-year-plus battle to get this right, to vote. And there's just this feeling of, like, you can be anything at this point. You could even be president of the United States. Of course, that hasn't quite happened yet. But there was definitely, at the start of the 20s, was this huge movement of women into all sorts of different jobs that they had maybe not worked in before. A huge mass movement into the creative arts. They were just absolutely through all of Hollywood in the silent movies, which was a very young industry, a very boom industry. They were hiring like mad. I think the only thing I can compare it to is the way social, again, very accessible. Anybody can go see a movie. It's very cheap. Everybody's talking about the movies. Everybody's writing about the movies. And it's kind of like the boom of the social media in California, when all of a sudden everybody's moving to California to get a job in the internet industry. Everybody is literally looking at Hollywood or New York, which is the other center of filmmaking, and thinking, I can go do that and I can make a phenomenal amount of money, because the wages were really good for the ones who made it. And so, yes, you have this huge mass migration of people who get off the train in Los Angeles and then somewhat recreate themselves. And that's another issue in the book, is that an awful lot of people just kind of make up their identity as they arrive in Hollywood to be the identity that the filmmaker wants, that the casting agent wants, So you have numerous stories of folks who are change their names, make up back histories, maybe lose family along the way. There's several instances of people who, are maybe supposed to be the bachelor around town, and really he's got a wife and 2 kids back in Peoria.
Yeah.
Revealed until much later in their career. But yeah, so there's all this kind of I call it identity fluidity that's happening as part of the marketing of the movies that they all bought into. And some of it's just like, maybe they're recreating themselves as the person they want to be. Yeah. They want to have this identity. Maybe they've come from a very poor background and they want to be seen as the rich man. And so they are now, the rich guy around town. And maybe they're going to sell their soul a little to maintain that identity. There's some of that going on. Yeah. And then you're in Arkham. Yeah. Selling your soul becomes a real possibility. So there you go.
So yeah, talking about that, does the story itself lean more to like the occult horror, sort of that sort of classic sort of Lovecraftian horror, or is it leaning more towards the mystery with some sprinklings of occult in it?
I think it's more. I'd say it's the love child of Robert Chambers and Mary Roberts Reinhardt. So there you go. It's less. It's not a lot of gore, and because I'm a very easy to scare person, and partially because I went back to sort of read Lovecraft's influences, and a big influence was Robert Chambers' King in Yellow, and you'll see that very much in the book. And one of the things that fascinated me about that short story is it's incredibly creepy. And it isn't really till the end that you know why it's incredibly creepy. And also, interestingly enough, it's not a contemporary story, because when he writes it, it's set in 1920s America, but he's writing it back at the end of the 19th century. So essentially, it's dystopian science fiction, maybe. It's a very hard story to. It's intrigued a lot of writers because it's a very hard story to define. So there is just this sort of creeping dread in it, and it's really an interesting piece to kind of pick apart. Mary Roberts Reinhardt writes very spooky stories with, unlike mine, have very Scooby-Doo endings. So what I always say is that for her, and probably her best, is a book called The Red House, which is about a haunted house. Okay. And the narrator is trying to solve several murders that happen around it. And there's always kind of a logical explanation at the end that's not supernatural. So it's like the Scooby-Doo. It's like, it's really old man so-and-so in a mask type of thing that she usually comes up with at the end of her books. Red House is a little different in that there's still an intimation of that there's maybe a supernatural explanation as well, which is unusual for her. And it's also told from the point of a male narrator, which is very unusual for her. So it's kind of a departure. So I can see, I had been thinking about The Bat, which was another one of her books when I started working on this, and I read Red House and I was like, oh, this is a very interesting approach. So those two are probably the most direct literary influences on this book. So you have to go. So go back and read those, and then read.
Yeah.
And see if you can.
I'm gonna have to rewatch this so I can make actually a note of.
Yeah, and then and then the Mary Roberts Reinhardt, that's kind of the best that the characters refer to, because they would know it. It was a huge book at the time. It was originally called The Circular Staircase, but it was dramatized as a silent movie and as a stage play as The Bat. And it's, again, about an older woman who goes to a house, a lot of creepy stuff happens. Turns out it's a master criminal. Ooh. And a master detective shows up to save her from the master criminal. And she kind of saves herself, which is also true of Reinhardt, that, her heroines tend to save themselves, and much more so as her books go along. And the interesting thing about that, just to weird out and cross streams here, supposedly the Bat was a big influence on the creator of Batman. So, and that was how he one of the reasons he came up with the idea of the dark detective. And and Batman.
Oh, that is interesting. Ooh.
Yeah.
Oh,
The more you dig into literary trivia, the more you find.
yeah. I wish I'd studied more about literature
See that?
rather than the sciences.
Yeah.
Yes. So, going back to Jeannie, what would her stats be if she was in an Arkham Horror game?
Oh, I know you told me that, and I'm terrible at.
So first of all, her class. So what class is she?
The reason I'm not a game designer and I'm a fiction writer is because mechanics always defeat me. And I have friends who are really good at them. So I always play, but I almost never run games or design them. I think her stats, some of her skills would probably include, she's a good investigator. She sort of looks beyond the obvious. You guys can help me out and tell me what that actually means in the card language.
She's clearly a survivor.
She's clearly a survivor. Thank you, James. Yes. Yeah, she is. She will make it through, and she's a good adapter. Because remember, she's a costumer and a prop maker. She's gonna kind of pick up whatever she's got and take it and adapt it to whatever the situation calls for. And she's used to kind of making stuff over and making them do, which comes from knowing a lot of costume designers and props makers who can make incredible stuff out of just almost nothing. And I've had the fortune over the years. I worked for years writing a kind of a interview column for a local Seattle newspaper where I was interviewing artists who were coming in town and working in town. And I always remember talking to the great Bob Mackey, who a lot of people know because he designed the curtain dress that Carol Burnett is famous for coming down the stairs. I made the dress out of the drapes, and it's got the curtain rod going through all across her shoulders, which Mackey claims will be on his tombstone. He also made almost all of Cher's costumes. So, again, the Cher photo. But he is still designing, and he's still working in theater. And one of the things I thought was really interesting talking to him is he talked about, he started out in television, and particularly in the early years of television and the Carol Burnett show and stuff, he didn't have a lot of time, which was somewhat similar to the situation that silent movie folks are dealing with. He was, churning out a lot of costumes very quickly. And so he haunted used clothing stores. He would buy stuff off the rack and adapt it. Everything was not precisely, I think we think of movies and television costumes as all being, really built out and very precise and very, heavily designed, which they can be. They can be absolutely gorgeous if you see them up close. But there's also a lot of people who learn to just kind of be very makeshift. And one of the comments I loved, I was reading Lillian Gish, who was a big screen star in the teens and 20s, and actually his career continued beyond that. Like a lot of actors in the silent movie, she and her sister Dorothy Gish and her mother kind of moved as a unit to Hollywood. The two girls, Dorothy and Lillian, were in lots and lots of movies, and Mama made their costumes. And that was not unusual at the time, especially before 1920. The actors were kind of required to provide their costumes and makeup. And so her mama could sew a flapper dress, or she could sew a pioneer woman dress. And so, that kind of gave the Gish girls a little bit of an advantage because they always had something that looked nice. And maybe their costumes looked a little nicer than the other girls because they didn't have that. So Jeannie is the designer to her sister, Renee Love, who somewhat conceal this relationship so Renee will not get typecast. But she always works with her, and she always makes sure that Renee looks fabulous. And that is actually, again, roots back to people like the Gishes, who usually worked as a family unit and really worked to keep each other looking good, because then the whole family, benefited because they kept working, and they were making phenomenal money for 3 women on their own. So, this was part of their motivating.
Yes. So, does Jeannie have another story in Arkham, or do you think she's probably seen enough of the occult?
What's really interesting is how many people are coming to tell me, like, you aren't going to send Jeannie back. I want you to go back to Arkham, but I don't want you to send Jeannie back. Because it's like Jeannie survived, and we want Jeannie to have her happy moment that she's having at the end of the book. So there's a spoiler, Jeannie, but since she's telling the story and looking back, you kind of do that anyway. And I think that's a huge compliment as an author. That always gives me a little bit of a glow to say, I love the fact that you're worried about Jeannie, that you don't want her to go back to Arkham. I think maybe going back to Arkham, but I think Jeannie is going to get her mo.
Yeah,
California sunshine. Yes.
Excellent.
So don't worry about Jeannie. I had another book that was somewhat similar. It was a dark fantasy that I did for another media tie-in where the characters were, adventuring through a dungeon, and it was very unlikely that everybody was going to get out. One of them had a dog. It had a pet, which apparently you don't do in D&D. I didn't know that. But I had with a pet. And I got the sweetest letter from a guy who said, I like my fantasy dark. I like it grim. I like it George R.R. Martin. But I got to know before I finish the book, is the dog going to survive?
Leave the puppy alone.
Because, if the puppy doesn't, I don't know if I want to go on. And I had to write him back. I said, no, it's fine. Absolutely no dogs were harmed in the making of this book. And I can say that about Mask of Silver, too. If you're worried about the Pumpkin, who is, kind of a minor character, it's okay. Remember, Pete and Duke are there, and Pete's not going to let a dog die. So, Pete's job. It's going to save Pumpkin.
So you've written other tie-in fiction as well for other people.
Yeah.
What's your favorite thing about writing tie-in fiction?
I love the fact that it's a shared world, and that's the other term we use for it a lot, in that, there are other people in there. You get to play around with, kind of ideas that have come out of there and then add your own spin to it. A lot of it's like writing historical fantasy, is that, you have kind of an established canon. There's an edge to the sandbox, I always say, but you got to go in it and build your own castle and kind of put your own mark on it. And for my other media tie-in, and also for this one, I always try to tread very lightly in other people's universes. So it's generally my characters, my plot, and these people are going to interact in the world that you're interested in, but they are going to be really nice to your world, and they are not going to blow it up. They're not going to make a huge change. Arkham is still standing when the movie is done. And you're going to be able to go back and enjoy other stories in that world. And the other thing is and this happens when I'm playing games, and so this is kind of how I write my fiction, is I'm always that person who's wondering, like, oh, you just ran past this NPC character who's sweeping the street, or rather, what do they think of you and your adventure party as you go rampaging through the graveyard, that they, like are in charge of keeping clean? And what are their frustrations, and what are their thoughts? And so one of my books, I actually the joke was I wrote the only D&D novel that's completely populated by NPC characters. City of the Dead. Because it's all about the people who actually take care of the graveyard in Waterdeep. And they do have adventures, and there are something going on, but it's largely from their point of view, and they're not super powered human beings. And that's kind of the other thing I like to do in media tie-in fiction, is I kind of like to take maybe the person, put them in that situation, and see how they can think their way out of it, how they can be that survivor, which is really, Arkham really lends itself to that. So was one of the really fun things about writing in the Arkham setting.
Yeah. So if you're not a survivor, you're not, you're not making it out. Not with your sanity, anyway.
But I think the thing is about Arkham is you don't have to have I mean, it helps to have certain skills, but you don't have to have them to be a survivor. You just really have to have a good heart and a willingness to work with others, and you know, and you can make it through. And I think that's, yeah, that will be found true if you read Mask of Silver.
So are there any challenges for writing crime fiction? And if so, how do you overcome them?
The challenges are always, again, to tread lightly in that world and not mess something up. And I have to say, thank you very much to the folks at Aconyte and Fantasy Flight Games for an incredibly great commentary as we were working on this, to say, no, you can't do that because that doesn't actually exist. Or, no, that person wouldn't be there at that time. The funny one about this one is I almost always start off with a map, and I'm used to that because most of the media tie-in stuff I've done has been RPGs, and maps are big in RPGs. Like, you know, this is the town, this is where the streets are. And I wrote to Lottie, my editor here at Aconyte, fairly early on and said, can I get a map of Arkham? Like, you know, where's Velma? And she said, well, there's the thing about the board game. Squares move by where you're putting it down. So maybe French Hill is over in the east, or maybe French Hill is over in the west. Maybe it's north or south of Velma's Diner. We don't really want to say because it changes.
Yeah.
Which then became kind of an interesting thought about, oh, you're in a town where you never really know whether it's east or west or north or south. You know, and so, and there are sort of thin spots where all of a sudden you're not where you thought you were. So, which are portals. And so that all kind of influenced. So that was kind of fun, but it was really interesting to be writing a book without a map. And I had to be kind of constantly thinking about, so, you know, how do I describe how they're going someplace? They're definitely moving, but they're not necessarily where I don't want to be too definitive. So if they're going wherever you think that is in Arkham, as the reader. So that's, you know, that's all. that was kind of the interesting challenge about that. And and then the other funny thing is, like I said, I wrote for years for the Forgotten Realms, which is, as anybody knows, has gone through many changes. And Blessed Greenwood, who's the creator of that property originally, you know, is always really nice about answering questions. But there is, like, I did actually, in City of the Dead, I have a guy with a guidebook, and it turns out the guidebook is completely wrong. And what I really was doing was I was citing all the, in player guide such and such, it says this, and in player guide such and such, it says that, and the two are completely conflicting. So I just had this poor wizard dude wandering around Waterdeep with a guidebook where the Waterdeep citizens were just laughing and going, you can never believe the guidebooks. They never get it right, you know. Which was also kind of my experience in New York when I was wandering around New York with a guidebook. So, yeah, I think there are moments when you get to kind of almost, you know, with great affection, tease the property a little bit, and that's kind of fun in a media tie-in.
I really like that idea. I'm like sitting here thinking, oh, next time I get to DM a game, I'm going to give them a guidebook that's ever so slightly wrong and just have them running around the town going, but the map says it's here.
Yes. It's like, yeah. And, you know, and the funny thing is it does. I mean, you know, I have Volvo's guide and I have the later Waterdeep guide, and they just, for a variety of reasons, they change things to fit different game models. And so, or maybe just didn't cross-check, you know, or miss something. And so, yeah, there's some, you know, there's just, so like, where is the gate into Waterdeep that I referenced? Well, good guess. You make a guess.
Oh, I love that idea. Yeah. So I've got like the Wall Street 3rd edition, and I've got the new 5th edition. Well, both with their big maps. Be interested to pull out their big maps and then see actually
take a look.
One to the party and just be like, that's the map you're going to be using. It's the one that you bought when you walked into the city, but I'm going to be using this one, and this is where you're actually going to go.
Exactly. You know, and it isn't major stuff. And I mean, obviously I mean, and I love the guys at WotC, and they do a really good job. But it was very funny because I think it was one of the characters is Lord Otterbrent, who is, Ed kind of crafted him, and then bless Ed just sort of handed him over to me and said, "Well, you do what you want with this character." And so, so I got to take my angry lord and explain why he was angry and do all these other fun things with him. But I had the hardest time figuring out where the Otterbrent mansion was, and and we finally just kind of went, well, they originally were over here, and then they moved, and it was over here. So it's like, I guess, because or maybe there was the side branch of the Otterbrent family in that house, because it was not consistent, and it was very funny. And when I was writing back to people, they would be going like, I don't know, like pick one.
It's one of these places.
One of these places. And I did, and I actually had a Neverwinter story that they were actually developing while I was writing, and that's always fun if you're a writer and you're doing media tie-in. They're developing, and it's like, and I guess it's the classic. I have the fight on the bridge, and I get this desperate note from the editor about no, that bridge doesn't exist. They took it out, and I'm like, but it's in these notes you sent me. Yeah, I know, but they took it out. Now there's a broken bridge, but nobody could be fighting in the middle, and I'm like, okay. So they'd be writing badly, on the edge of the broken bridge, they have the sword fight. So those are kind of I always think those are actually kind of the fun challenges of somebody's developing a game while you're writing the story, because I was writing the story as kind of an introduction to the new Neverwinter, and it was just like, and they were, giving me notes as they were going along and making creative decisions, and it was like, okay. The nice thing about Arkham is Arkham's pretty established, so I felt like most of the stuff I could look it up, and like I said, I got great notes back from FFG and from Aconyte, and they just little things where they're like, yeah, you kind of it was mostly I misinterpreted something they had said. So
yeah, the FFG team are very knowledgeable on all of their IPs like that. I hear nothing but good things for Katrina and the team.
They're fabulous. Yeah, no, they're really good. They go through and they really fine-tooth comb it to keep in line with the property. And I really appreciate, as an author, I really appreciate that attention to proofing, because there's nothing worse than having something come out and somebody write you and go, by the way, did you know? And I've had that happen too, and that's fine. I actually did have somebody spot in a property one time, a book that a flying skull was supposedly trapped in a closed room and then reappears later in the dungeon, and they're like, how did that happen? I'm like, magic.
Obviously.
So.
Right. Well, I think we're coming kind of to the end of the chat here. If anyone in chat watching has any questions, let me know. Ping them over into the comments, and we will answer those. While we wait for that, have you got anything else that you want to plug? Anything going on at the moment, either author-wise or wider world stuff that you want people to know about?
A new book, Mask of Silver, really a fun read. Hopefully you'll have a good time with it. It's like this came out. Oh yay! There it goes. It flashes on the screen. I mean, like, really, it came out like 2 weeks ago for me. It's like I'm still really excited about it. It's just, but yeah, I'm starting to work on some. I have some anthology stuff. I do a lot of short fiction, and so I have a couple of anthology requests that I'm working on right now, one of which is a science fiction adaptation of Hans My Hedgehog, the Grimm story. So I'm working on cloning and fairy tales for that one. And maybe doing a little research on the 1920s for something we can't talk about yet. But
but we're all very excited to maybe possibly.
We're all very excited about it. Yeah. It'll be another plague year before it's out. But so I have some. I'm starting to look at what the silent movie industry was doing in the later 1920s, and maybe some other industries, like the aeronautical industry. So lots of
Yeah.
fun research. That's actually what I love about doing, like sort of the prep period, is I love doing the deep dive into the research and starting to, pull up the really strange, weird facts.
Yeah.
Because, there's nothing you can think of in fantasy that's weirder than actual history.
Yeah.
There's always stuff that you get into. And I will plug here, one of my favorite used bookstore Twitter streams is based in London. It's the Henry Southern bookstore. If you don't follow them on Twitter, Oliver is hysterically funny. And he also comes up with
retweet one today from there.
Yeah, and he comes up with this just incredibly odd history, and the store itself. I mean, I want to be able to travel again. I want to come to London because, the store is, as they pointed out, older than my country. Established in 1760, and they have survived plagues and bombings and everything else in London, and they're still standing. And they're really fun to follow, and they have a lot of really fun, weird, but true book stuff that may kind of appear in an upcoming volume. Because the idea of, books were made with arsenic colored cloth, which was a Victorian thing. If you used arsenic, you got a certain shade of green, and they dyed the cloth that they bound the books in it. And so actually handling those books is maybe not a good idea, especially if you have food afterwards. So if you collect books from the mid-19th century and they're brilliant green, you might want to get them tested or use gloves. And stuff like that, it's just, I'm like, ooh, that has some nice spooky possibilities there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that would be fun. Yeah. Someone has brought over some books from England.
Yes.
Mix it with some Arkham Horror.
Books moments change. There's also a book, really fun story. It's called The Great Omar. It's actually true. It was a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam that is just enormously gorgeous. It was commissioned in about 1910, 11, somewhere in there. And it was to be sold for about £1,000, which was a phenomenal price. It was bound in leather, bound in jewels. It's really an art object. And it went down on the Titanic. So it was lost. So, and then the man who created the binding was drowned trying to rescue somebody. It's kind of a weird history there.
Yeah.
I remember the family taking his notes, created a second Great Omar, which the bookstore stored in a bank vault during the Blitz, and it was bombed. One of the books was destroyed. So they tried again, third time. That one is in the British Museum collection. So it is actually the Great Omar the Third, I guess. And it is not on display, and apparently it's locked down in the vault. So, when you start thinking about that there's this really bad luck book, but it's phenomenally beautiful. You see the designs of the cover. It's like, that would be kind of an interesting thing to slide into Arkham. So
someone could steal it from the British Museum.
You just really want it, and then what if the book kept coming back? What if you're the bookseller who knows it's a phenomenally bad luck book and it keeps coming back to you? As various owners go down with the Titanic, etc.
I like it. I like it a lot. Do it.
We might have some of that. But anyway, that's why history is so fabulous, because you can keep coming up with these very wonderful, strange stuff. And then you're like, oh, I could use that in a story.
Yeah. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming along and talking.
Thank you for the conversation, and have a lovely dinner.
Yes. Oh, I shall, I'm sure. Yes, I'm going to do some painting first, though, and then I'll have dinner. But a couple of hours of painting first. But yes, it's been really lovely to talk to you. Thank you, chat, for coming along. We have been talking about the Mask of Silver, which is out now in the USA in paperback and is available globally. So everywhere that you can buy an ebook, you can get the ebook of it. It will be available in the UK from the 18th of March.
Yes. And hopefully you have a really fun time, because I do want to say that. I mean, I may talk about a lot of issues and stuff, but I really write to entertain. And so I hope when you close the covers, you just think, wow, that was really fun to go rolling through Arkham. And while I may not want Jeannie to go back, I would like to go back to Arkham, because I certainly would like to go back to Arkham.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for coming along. Thank you, Rosemary. And we will see you again next week when we talk to, I'm not sure yet, but we're talking to someone.
Fabulous author.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Author. Yes. Wonderful. Right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.